It was late afternoon on a crowded city street, the kind of place where noise never really stops. Cars rolled past in slow lines, horns tapping impatient rhythms, and people moved along the sidewalks with their eyes fixed on phones, schedules, and destinations. In the middle of all that motion, an elderly man made his way forward one careful step at a time. His back was slightly bent, one hand gripping a worn cane, the other holding a small grocery bag that brushed against his leg with each step. He wasn't asking for attention. He wasn't bothering anyone. He was simply trying to get home. That's when a group of young men noticed him. At first, it was subtle, snickers exchanged between them, low comments meant only for each other. They slowed their walk, matching his pace, circling him like bored predators looking for entertainment. One of them mimicked the way he walked, exaggerating the limp. Another laughed loudly, making sure others around could hear. The elderly man kept his eyes down. He pretended not to notice. Years of life had taught him that sometimes the safest response was silence. But silence only encouraged them. One of the young men stepped in front of him, blocking his path. Another moved behind him. Phones came out, cameras rolling, ready to capture a moment they thought would be funny later. The insults grew louder now, about his age, his weakness, the way he looked. People nearby slowed, some watching openly, others glancing quickly before turning away, unwilling to get involved. The old man's grip tightened on his cane. His hand trembled, not just from age, but from the humiliation burning in his chest. He tried to step around them, but someone nudged his shoulder. The grocery bag slipped slightly, a soft rustle of paper echoing louder than it should have. Then it happened. One of them kicked the cane aside. It clattered against the pavement and slid a few feet away. For a brief moment, the world seemed to pause. The elderly man froze, unsteady, struggling to keep his balance. Laughter exploded from the group, sharp and cruel, cutting through the noise of the street. A few people gasped. Someone whispered, "Hey," but no one stepped forward. In that moment, it felt like the entire street had chosen to look away. What the young men didn't realize was that someone else had already seen everything, and he was no longer willing to stay silent. Across the street, slightly removed from the growing scene, Seagal stood still. He hadn't been part of the crowd, hadn't been moving with any urgency. He was simply there, paused near the edge of the sidewalk, his attention drawn not by the noise itself, but by the tone of it. There was a difference between the normal chaos of a busy street and the sharp, ugly sound of cruelty, and Stephen recognized it instantly. He watched the group of young men surround the elderly man. He saw the way they positioned themselves, blocking paths, cutting off escape without even realizing they were doing it. He noticed the phones in their hands, the casual confidence in their posture, the kind that comes from believing there will be no consequences. Stephen's expression didn't change, but his focus sharpened. Years of discipline had taught him to observe before acting. Stephen had spent most of his life training in Aikido, a martial art centered not on aggression, but on awareness, balance, and control. He understood movement, intent, and the subtle shifts in body language that signaled when a situation was about to cross a line, and he could see that line approaching fast. The elderly man tried to step away. Stephen saw his hesitation, the slight stumble, the way his shoulders tightened as the laughter grew louder. When the cane was kicked aside, Stephen's jaw tightened, not in anger but in resolve. That single act wasn't a joke. It was a declaration of dominance, and that was enough. Stephen took one slow step forward. No rush, no dramatic gestures, just movement with purpose. People nearby barely noticed him at first. To them, he looked like a tall, broad-shouldered man dressed simply, blending into the city like anyone else. There were no cameras pointed at him, no whispers of recognition yet. Fame had taught Stephen how invisible he could be when he wanted to be. He crossed the street calmly, each step measured. His breathing remained steady, his shoulders relaxed. This wasn't a confrontation in his mind, it was a correction. Violence wasn't his goal, ending the situation was. As he drew closer, the energy of the scene began to shift. The young men were still laughing, but it was uneven now, distracted. One of them glanced over Stephen's shoulder, sensing movement, though he didn't yet understand why it made him uneasy. Stephen stopped a few feet away. Close enough to be heard, close enough to be seen. He took in the details quickly, the distance between bodies, the position of the elderly man, the direction the cane had slid across the pavement. Everything mattered. His eyes moved calmly from one face to another, not staring, not challenging, just assessing. To someone trained, his posture said everything. He wasn't tense. He wasn't afraid. He was completely in control. For a brief second, the world seemed to narrow to that small space on the sidewalk. A traffic noise faded into the background. Conversations blurred into static. The focus settled on the quiet man who had stepped forward without saying a word. The young men still hadn't recognized him. They didn't know his name. They didn't know his history. They didn't know what he was capable of. All they knew was that someone had finally chosen to stop watching, and that alone was enough to make the air feel heavier than before. The elderly man's hands shook as he tried to regain his balance. His eyes darted around, searching for anyone who might intervene. But the street, crowded as it was, seemed frozen in place. Most people had stopped walking, their attention caught by the unusual tension in the air. The young men surrounding the old man were laughing, but there was an edge now, a hint of uncertainty creeping into their bravado. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, Steven Seagal moved closer. He didn't rush. He didn't make a sound. He simply approached with the kind of calm confidence that only comes from decades of discipline. Every step was deliberate, measured, precise. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture wildly. Yet the atmosphere began to shift, almost imperceptibly, as if the street itself was taking a breath in anticipation. Steven stopped a few feet away from the group. His eyes met the gaze of the tallest young man, who had been pushing and mocking the elderly man the most. For a brief moment, there was only silence, an invisible line drawn between those who intended harm and the man who would not allow it. Then Steven spoke. "Let him go." The words were calm, low, but every syllable carried weight. They weren't a threat. They weren't a challenge. They were simply a command, spoken with the quiet authority of someone who knows exactly what they are capable of. The young men froze, confusion flickering across their faces. One of them smirked, trying to mask his growing uncertainty. "Mind your business, old man," he sneered. Steven didn't respond with anger or intimidation. He didn't need to. He simply took another step closer, his posture relaxed, hands open, showing he posed no immediate threat. But the subtle tension in his movement, the way he controlled his breathing, the calm focus in his eyes, it all communicated a single truth. He could end this situation in an instant if he chose to. The street felt different now. The air was heavy with anticipation. Pedestrians instinctively gave a wider berth, sensing something had shifted, even if they didn't yet understand what. Phones lowered slightly, laughter faltered, and the group of young men found themselves subtly backing up, each of them instinctively aware that their energy had been measured and found wanting. Then came the first physical mistake. One of the young men, emboldened by misplaced bravado, reached out to shove Steven. It was a mistake he would regret in an instant. In one fluid motion, Steven redirected the force, using nothing but precise control and balance. The young man stumbled, then fell to the ground unhurt but completely disoriented. His friends froze, shocked by how effortlessly the situation had turned against them. For a moment there was absolute silence. The crowd held its collective breath. The elderly man straightened slightly, eyes wide in disbelief, gripping his cane once again. The young men exchanged nervous glances. The arrogance that had filled the street only seconds ago now replaced by uncertainty and fear. Steven's voice broke the silence again, firm but calm. "You walk away. Now. No yelling. No theatrics. Just authority in its purest form." Slowly, deliberately, each of the young men stepped back, some turning and walking away without a word. The crowd began murmuring, whispers spreading like wildfire. "Was that Steven Seagal? No way. Did you see that?" The elderly man, still holding his cane, looked at Steven, eyes wide with gratitude and awe. Steven knelt slightly, picking up the cane and handing it back gently, his expression unreadable. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked quietly. The old man nodded, his voice caught in his throat, unable to form words that could convey his relief and gratitude. Before anyone could respond, Steven turned and walked away. No applause, no recognition, no interviews. Just quiet, measured steps down the sidewalk, blending back into the crowd as if nothing had happened. The street remained unusually still, the kind of silence that follows true authority. The incident left more than just physical calm in its wake. It left a lesson in power, control, and respect. Strength isn't always loud. Authority doesn't require shouting. And sometimes, the mere presence of someone who truly understands both can change everything in seconds. Even after Steven had gone, the whispers continued. The story of what had happened would spread along the street, carried in fragments of shock, admiration, and disbelief. People realized that moments like these are rare, The kind that remind everyone that the world still has those who step forward when others choose silence. In that moment, the young men who had been mocking and harassing realized something critical: their arrogance had met its match. And the elderly man, who had been vulnerable just seconds before, felt a reassurance and dignity restored, not through violence, but through quiet, undeniable authority. This was not a fight to prove dominance. This was a demonstration of respect, control, and unwavering calm. And in that demonstration, the street had learned a powerful lesson it would not forget.
What would you have done if you were standing there? Would you step in or look away like most of the crowd? Comment below, Yue.
The street had transformed. What was once chaotic noise now felt heavy with anticipation, as if time itself had slowed down to observe what was unfolding. Pedestrians froze mid-step, conversations halted mid-sentence, and the young men who had been brash moments ago suddenly felt the weight of their actions pressing down on them. The air itself seemed charged, an invisible current of tension that neither laughter nor defiance could break. Seagal stood calmly, a few feet from the elderly man, his posture relaxed yet commanding. Every movement, no matter how subtle, exuded confidence. His eyes scanned the group, noting not just their positions but the energy behind their gestures, the hesitation hidden beneath forced bravado. One could almost feel the mental calculation he performed in each second, reading intent, predicting motion, anticipating every possible reaction. To the untrained eye, it appeared as if he simply stood there, waiting. But in reality, he was in full control. The young men shifted uneasily. They had expected compliance from the bystanders, perhaps a few nervous looks or muttered protests, but not this. Not a man who seemed entirely unfazed by their intimidation. Their smirks faltered, nervous glances flickered toward one another, an unspoken question hanging in the air. Who is this man? And why does he make me feel so small? One of them attempted to regain control, raising his voice in mockery. You think you're going to stop us? He sneered. His words were loud, but lacked the certainty they had held just moments ago. Stephen didn't respond immediately. He simply shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement that conveyed readiness. His breathing remained slow, steady, controlled, a silent declaration that he could handle any sudden aggression without effort. Then, almost imperceptibly, Stephen's body language began to affect the group. His calm, deliberate presence created a ripple in the energy of the street. The laughter and jeers faltered and then stopped altogether. Phones lowered mid-recording. The audience of pedestrians instinctively gave wider space, sensing a shift they couldn't quite explain. Even the elderly man, still gripping his cane, felt the tension in a new way. He realized he was no longer just the victim in the scene. One of the young men, emboldened by panic and adrenaline, tried to step forward, testing the waters. It was a critical mistake. Stephen's eyes followed him, unflinching, measuring. In one fluid, practiced motion, he redirected the man's energy, an almost imperceptible shift of the arm and balance. The young man stumbled, tripped slightly, and fell onto the pavement, unhurt but thoroughly shaken. The crowd gasped. The subtlety of the move left no room for argument. It was control, not cruelty. The other young men froze instantly, their confidence evaporating. They had assumed superiority, thought that chaos and intimidation would always grant them power. But the calm authority before them challenged everything they believed. They stepped back instinctively, some taking careful steps to create distance, others retreating entirely. Their faces revealed disbelief, nervousness, and even a trace of fear. Stephen spoke again, his voice low, steady, and measured. You walk away, now. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a threat. It was simply command, pure authority in its quietest form. The words carried weight, more than any raised fist or angry outburst could have achieved. Slowly, the young men obeyed, retreating down the street without incident. The crowd remained silent, the spell of the moment lingering in the air. The elderly man straightened, leaning lightly on his cane. He looked at Stephen, gratitude and astonishment etched into every line of his face. Stephen knelt slightly, retrieved the cane that had been kicked aside, and handed it back with a quiet, reassuring nod. Were you all right, sir? He asked. The man could only nod, his voice caught in his throat. No words could express the relief, the sudden restoration of dignity he had felt. The lesson had been made without a single loud confrontation, without rage or violence. Respect had been restored through calm, deliberate authority. The crowd began to murmur softly, whispers spreading rapidly. Was that Steven Seagal? I think so. Did you see that? The shock on their faces was palpable. Even those who had not recognized him at first now realized they had just witnessed something extraordinary. A display of power without aggression, control without cruelty, and respect earned instantly. For a few moments, the street remained still. Pedestrians who had been hurriedly going about their day paused, exchanging stories of what had just occurred. The young men who had been mocking and harassing were left to process what had happened to them, shaken, humbled, and silently aware that they had crossed a line they had no idea existed. Stephen rose, straightening his posture. He didn't linger. He didn't seek recognition. He simply walked away, blending back into the crowd as though he had never arrived. The sound of the street slowly returned, the hum of traffic, the chatter of passersby. But the effect of the moment lingered. Those who had witnessed it would carry the lesson with them. Authority doesn't need to shout. Power doesn't need to prove itself through aggression. And above all, respect is not something to demand, it is something to command through presence, control, and unwavering confidence. In the seconds of silence that followed Stephen's intervention, the street learned a lesson it wouldn't soon forget. Every bystander, every pedestrian, and every one of the young men left with a clear understanding: true strength is measured not by force, but by composure, precision, and the courage to act when others fail to do so. The young men who had caused the chaos a few moments ago now stood scattered, some leaning against walls, others stepping hesitantly back onto the sidewalks, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and shame. They had entered the situation with arrogance, expecting to intimidate, to assert dominance through mockery and aggression. But the moment they encountered Stephen Seagal, everything changed. What had begun as a scene of public humiliation had become a lesson in restraint, discipline, and the quiet assertion of authority. Stephen Seagal remained calm, composed, his gaze sweeping over the group without a hint of malice. There was no anger in his eyes, no need for vengeance, no desire to make a spectacle of anyone. Instead, there was something far more powerful: controlled presence. His body language alone, relaxed shoulders, open palms, steady stance, communicated a level of confidence that words could not match. The kind of confidence that told the young men that resistance was pointless, and that escalation was unnecessary. "You walk away." Now he repeated, his voice low, firm, and unwavering. It was a command, simple yet absolute. The young men hesitated, exchanging nervous glances, but each realized instinctively that defiance was not an option. They stepped back one by one, slowly, their movements stiff and uncertain. No one tried to argue. No one dared to challenge him. The presence of a man who could end the situation without striking a single blow had rendered their aggression meaningless. Pedestrians around the scene began to notice the subtle shift in energy. Phones that had previously been recording were lowered, whispers spread like wildfire, and a few brave onlookers even stepped closer, cautiously observing the aftermath. The street, which had been alive with the noise of traffic and city chatter, now held a quiet tension. The air seemed heavier, almost reverent, as if acknowledging that something extraordinary had just occurred. The elderly man, still holding his cane, stood slightly straighter than before. He looked at Stephen, eyes wide with relief and gratitude, a silent understanding passing between them. Stephen knelt slightly, retrieved the cane that had been pushed aside, and handed it back with a quiet nod. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked softly. His tone was gentle, almost compassionate, yet it carried the weight of authority. The old man nodded, unable to find words to express his gratitude. The simple act of returning the cane, coupled with the unwavering calm in Stephen's demeanor, restored not only his physical balance but also his dignity. It was a subtle yet profound demonstration of power used responsibly, power not to dominate, but to protect. Even after the young men had retreated, whispers continued to ripple through the crowd. "Was that Stephen Seagal?" "I think so." Unbelievable. The realization that they had just witnessed a legendary martial artist handle a dangerous situation without violence left bystanders awestruck. It became clear that authority does not always roar, sometimes it speaks quietly, yet commands more respect than any shout ever could. The lesson for the crowd, and for anyone observing, was clear: strength is measured not by how loudly it is asserted, but by how effectively it is controlled. Stephen Seagal had turned a potentially humiliating encounter into a demonstration of discipline, patience, and precise action. The young men had learned an invaluable lesson about respect, while the elderly man had his dignity fully restored, and the street had been reminded of the power of calm authority. For a few more moments, Stephen remained there, ensuring that the situation had fully de-escalated. Once he was satisfied that the young men would not attempt further aggression, he straightened, taking a deep, controlled breath, and began to walk away. Each step was deliberate, measured, and composed. He didn't linger for recognition or applause. The act itself was enough. The pedestrians watched him leave, some whispering, some pointing, but all silently acknowledging the rare display of strength and restraint they had just witnessed. Even those who had not recognized him understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The street gradually returned to its usual rhythm, but the impact of the moment lingered in the minds of all present. Audience engagement moment. Have you ever witnessed someone stepping in to stop injustice in real life? How did it feel, and what did you learn from it? Share your experience in the comments below. This moment was more than just a confrontation. It was a lesson in life. It showed that true authority does not require violence, loud words, or public recognition. It demonstrated that control, patience, and awareness are far more effective in resolving conflict than aggression. The young men, humbled by the encounter, carried a lesson they would not forget. The elderly man, whose dignity had been under attack, regained not just his physical balance, but his sense of security. And the crowd, witnesses to the event, left with a deeper understanding of what it truly means to possess power, the quiet, unwavering kind that commands respect without demanding it. Even after Stephen had disappeared into the crowd, the whispers persisted, each retelling slightly more odd than the last. The story spread not because of drama or spectacle, but because of the demonstration of skill, calm, and ethical authority. The day's events reminded everyone present that courage comes in many forms, and sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the greatest power. Moments like these are rare, but they leave lasting impressions. They teach us that intervention doesn't need to be loud to be effective. Authority doesn't need to be feared to command respect. And sometimes, all it takes is a calm presence to turn chaos into order, fear into safety, and humiliation into dignity restored. Even after the young men had walked away, the street remained quiet, as though the city itself was catching its breath. Pedestrians who had been on their way paused, craning their necks to watch the aftermath of what had just occurred. Phones that had been recording earlier now hung limply in the hands of their owners. Conversations resumed slowly in hushed tones, whispers spreading from one group of people to another.
Did you see that?
That man, he just stopped them, without hurting anyone. It must have been Seagal. The elderly man, still gripping his cane, looked at Stephen with wide, grateful eyes. He could barely speak, words stuck in his throat, but the weight of the moment, of having dignity restored in an instant, was clearer than any sentence he could form. Stephen's quiet presence, his calm authority, had done what intimidation or anger never could. It had resolved the situation with precision and integrity. Pedestrians slowly began to approach the elderly man, offering support, a few murmuring words of encouragement. "Are you okay, sir?" "Don't worry, it's over now." But all eyes remained subtly drawn to the figure of Steven Seagal. Even without shouting, he had captured the attention of everyone present, leaving an unmistakable imprint of respect. Some people in the crowd whispered excitedly about what had just happened, piecing together the narrative of the encounter, as if they were sharing a secret. One person noted the control with which he handled the aggressors. Another marveled at the calm authority he had shown, noting that it required far more strength to resolve a confrontation without violence than with it. The lesson was clear. Power doesn't always need to be loud or visible. Meanwhile, the young men who had instigated the harassment lingered on the edges of the crowd, their faces pale and expressions tense. Their laughter and arrogance had completely disappeared. Even their friends seemed reluctant to approach them, sensing that the balance of authority had shifted in ways they didn't fully understand. For a brief moment, they were humbled in the most direct way possible. They had been confronted not with aggression, but with presence, focus, and skill. The realization of their mistake slowly sank in. Stephen knelt down briefly to adjust the elderly man's grip on his cane, offering a reassuring nod. "Are you sure you're all right?" he asked once more, though it was more rhetorical than necessary. The old man nodded again, swallowing hard, still overwhelmed with relief. There was no need for words. His gratitude was understood in every glance, every subtle gesture. Once Stephen was confident that the situation had been fully resolved, he straightened and prepared to leave. His steps were deliberate, controlled, and calm. The pedestrians watched silently, still caught between awe and disbelief. Some followed at a distance, as though hoping to catch a final glimpse. Others simply whispered among themselves, retelling the story they had just witnessed, unsure if it would be believed if recounted elsewhere. As Stephen walked away, the whispers continued, each retelling filled with admiration. People had been reminded of a fundamental truth: strength and authority are not defined by volume, size, or intimidation. They are defined by control awareness, and the ability to act decisively when others falter. His calm presence had stopped the aggression, protected the vulnerable, and restored order in a way that made an impression far deeper than a fight ever could. The elderly man, once vulnerable and humiliated, now stood with renewed dignity. Pedestrians continued their day, but the lesson lingered: courage is not always physical. Sometimes it is a quiet act, a single moment of control, that changes everything. The street itself seemed to have absorbed the lesson, carrying it with each passing pedestrian, each whispered retelling. The young men would not forget this encounter. They had been forced to confront their arrogance, to recognize a level of skill and authority they could neither mimic nor intimidate. And the crowd, having witnessed it all, would carry the story forward, not as a tale of violence, but as a lesson in respect, composure, and power exercised responsibly. Even after Stephen disappeared into the flow of the city, the impact of the event remained. The crowd's reaction, a mixture of awe, gratitude, and reflection, illustrated that sometimes the most powerful moments are silent, subtle, and executed with unwavering calm. And those who had observed the scene, whether in disbelief or admiration, would remember it for years, a reminder that true authority doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be present.
Have you ever been in a situation where someone stepped in to stop a problem calmly, without violence? How did it feel? Share your story in the comments below. UAE.
Even after Steven Seagal had walked away, the street seemed to hold its breath. Pedestrians who had been scattered, moving in different directions, now lingered, speaking in hushed tones. The usual rush of traffic, the chatter of bystanders, the clatter of footsteps, all of it seemed muted, as if the city itself was processing the extraordinary moment it had just witnessed. What had begun as a simple act of harassment had transformed into a lesson in authority, respect, and calm power. The elderly man, still clutching his cane, took slow steps toward the edge of the sidewalk. Though shaken, his posture was more upright than before. The humiliation he had endured moments earlier had been replaced with a quiet sense of security. Someone had stepped in when no one else would, and that intervention had restored his dignity in a way that no words could fully express. He looked around, noticing the eyes of bystanders still lingering on him and the figure who had protected him. Though Stephen had already disappeared into the flow of the city, his presence was still palpable, like a quiet ripple in the air that refused to fade. The young men, who had initially caused the disruption, now stood at a distance, their expressions a mixture of shock, disbelief, and newfound humility. Their arrogance had evaporated. The laughter that had once filled the street was replaced by silence, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any words. They had encountered a force they did not understand, not aggression, not intimidation, but calm, deliberate authority that required no display of anger to assert itself. Each one of them instinctively understood that they had crossed a line, and that line had consequences far beyond what they had anticipated. For the crowd of onlookers, the scene became more than just a spectacle. It was a lesson in human behavior and the power of presence. People began discussing in low voices the way Stephen had handled the situation, not with violence, but with precision, awareness, and confidence. There was awe in their voices, a recognition that the events they had witnessed were rare and remarkable. Pedestrians slowly resumed their movement, but the story would be carried forward, shared in whispers and conversations. A reminder that courage and authority manifest in many forms. The elderly man finally managed to speak, his voice trembling but sincere. "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you," he said, addressing the empty space where Stephen had been only moments before. The gratitude in his tone reflected more than relief. It reflected a restoration of respect and dignity that could never be taken lightly. Though the man could not reach Stephen directly, the lesson had been imparted clearly: courage does not always roar, and authority does not always demand recognition. Audience engagement moment. Have you ever witnessed someone intervene calmly and decisively in a tense situation? How did it make you feel? Share your thoughts in the comments below. As the crowd slowly dispersed, there was a shared understanding among those who had watched true power is subtle, deliberate, and responsible. Steven Seagal's intervention had demonstrated that strength is not about striking first, or shouting the loudest, or forcing others into submission. It is about awareness, control, and the ability to act when necessary in a way that restores order without creating chaos. The lesson extended beyond the immediate scene. It was applicable in life, in relationships, and in moments where integrity and courage are tested. The young men would leave with this lesson imprinted in their minds. They had confronted someone who required no violence to assert authority, and the memory of that calm, precise intervention would linger long after they had gone. They had been humbled, forced to reconsider their behavior, and the assumptions that had led them to harass another human being. For them, the encounter was a turning point, one that could influence how they approached others in the future. For the bystanders, the impact was equally profound. The act of intervention, carried out without aggression but with full awareness, highlighted a truth often forgotten: standing up for what is right does not always require confrontation. Sometimes, presence, calm, and controlled action are enough to shift the balance, protect the vulnerable, and command respect. By the time the street returned to its normal rhythm, the story had already begun to circulate. Whispers turned into conversations, conversations into retellings, and retellings into lessons shared far beyond the scene. What had seemed like a fleeting moment in time became an enduring example of courage, restraint, and the power of human presence. The memory of that day would remain etched in the minds of all who had witnessed it. The elderly man, the crowd, and even the young men would carry it with them, a reminder that true strength is measured not by volume or aggression, but by composure, awareness, and the quiet confidence to act decisively when it matters most. And in the end, the street itself seemed changed, forever marked by a moment when cruelty met calm authority, and dignity was restored in seconds.